At 6:17 in the morning, a park ranger found a campsite that looked completely normal. There was a tent, a sleeping bag, a fire that had gone cold, and a pair of hiking boots sitting neatly beside the entrance. But there was one problem. There was nobody there. Not one person, not one vehicle, not even a backpack. The strangest part was the food. Breakfast had been prepared. 2 cups were sitting beside the fire, and one of them was still warm. The ranger immediately called for backup. Because this wasn't an abandoned campsite, someone had been there only minutes earlier, and according to the trail camera nearby, someone had walked into that campsite during the night. But nobody was ever recorded walking back out. This is the story of what happened at the empty campsite. Part 1. The Arrival. It happened during the first week of October. The nights had already become cold. The forest was quiet, and most of the summer campers were gone. A young couple had driven several hours into the mountains looking for a quiet place to spend the weekend. They weren't experienced survivalists. They weren't looking for anything dangerous. They simply wanted 2 nights away from the city. They arrived shortly before sunset. The campsite was surrounded by tall trees. There was no cell service, no nearby houses, and only one narrow road leading back to the main highway. They set up their tent before dark. Then they built a small fire. Everything seemed normal. At around 8:30 p.m., they sent one final message to a friend. The message was simple. "We found the perfect place." That was the last message anyone received from them. For the next few hours, nothing unusual was reported. No screams, no emergency calls, no strange lights, nothing. Then sometime after midnight, something changed. A nearby trail camera captured movement. At first, it looked like an animal. Then the figure stepped closer to the camera. It was a person, a tall person, walking slowly through the trees. But the camera captured something disturbing. The person wasn't carrying a flashlight, and they weren't following the trail. They were walking directly toward the couple's campsite. Part 2. The night. Inside the tent, the couple were still awake. At least that's what investigators later believed, because their phones showed activity shortly after midnight. One phone was used to open the weather app. The other had been unlocked several times. Then, at 12:47 a.m., one of the phones recorded a short audio clip. It lasted only 11 seconds. For the first few seconds, there was nothing, just wind. Then came a sound, 3 slow knocks, not on the tent, on something outside. The couple apparently stopped talking. Then one voice whispered, "Did you hear that?" A few seconds later, another sound appeared. Footsteps, slow footsteps, walking around the tent. The audio ended there. Investigators would later replay that recording dozens of times because there was something unusual about the footsteps. They never seemed to move away. They kept circling, again and again and again. At approximately 1:06 a.m., the trail camera captured the same figure standing near the campsite. It remained there for nearly 4 minutes. Then the camera stopped recording, not because the battery died, not because it malfunctioned. The lens had been covered. Something had been placed directly over it, and after that moment, there was no more footage. Part 3. The morning. The next morning, another camper noticed something strange. The couple's car was still parked at the campsite. The tent was still standing. The fire pit still contained warm ashes, but the campsite was completely silent. At first, the camper assumed they were sleeping. Then he noticed the boots. They were outside the tent, both pairs, and they were positioned neatly beside the entrance. That didn't make sense. The temperature had dropped below freezing overnight. Nobody would normally walk through the forest barefoot. The camper called out. No answer. He opened the tent and immediately stepped back. Everything was still inside. Sleeping bags, clothes, phones, wallets, car keys, even the couple's food. Nothing appeared to have been packed. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. It looked as if the 2 people had simply disappeared. The ranger arrived shortly afterward. He searched the surrounding forest. There were no obvious footprints, no blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing. But then he noticed something near the edge of the trees, a second set of footprints. They began about 30 yards from the campsite, and they led deeper into the forest. The strange part, there was only one set, and investigators couldn't determine who had made them, because the footprints were much larger than either victim's shoes. Then the ranger found something else. Something that completely changed the investigation. A small piece of fabric was hanging from a tree branch, and it belonged to neither of the missing campers. Someone else had been inside that forest. Someone who had never been accounted for. and they may have been there long before the couple arrived. Part 4. The Search. By noon, the forest was filled with search teams. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters searched the surrounding mountains. Rangers checked every trail, every creek, and every abandoned structure within several miles. But the dogs kept doing something strange. They would follow the couple's scent away from the campsite, then suddenly stop. Every time, at the exact same location. There was no cliff, no river, no road, nothing that explained why the scent disappeared. Investigators searched the ground. They found broken branches, a few footprints, and a deep mark in the soil. It looked almost like something heavy had been dragged through the forest. But the trail ended after only a few yards. There was nothing at the end. No body, no clothing, nothing. Then one of the search dogs began barking toward the trees. The handler followed its attention. Between two large trees was a narrow opening, almost impossible to see from the main trail. Inside was a small clearing, and in that clearing, someone had been living. There were empty food containers, old blankets, rusty cans, and several pieces of clothing. Some of them looked years old. The investigators couldn't determine who they belonged to, but then they found something that made everyone stop. A photograph. It showed the same campsite, the exact same location, but the photograph was old, very old. And standing beside the fire pit were two people, a man and a woman, the same two people who had disappeared. Part 5. The Photograph. The photograph was taken before the couple had ever visited the area. At least that's what investigators believed. There was no date written on it, but the paper was badly damaged. The image itself looked decades old. The investigators compared the faces. There was no doubt. It was the missing couple. But how could that be possible? They had only arrived the previous evening, and the photograph showed them standing at the campsite during daylight, wearing different clothes. Behind them was the same tent, the same fire pit, the same trees. Even the same hiking boots were visible. One investigator suggested the photograph had been edited. Another believed someone had been following the couple. But neither explanation answered the biggest question. Who took the photograph? The search continued. Then 3 days later, one of the missing phones suddenly connected to a cell tower. For exactly 9 seconds, the signal came from deep inside the forest, a location where there was no road, no cabin, and almost no way to reach it. A team was sent there immediately. They found the phone lying on a rock. The screen was cracked. The battery was nearly dead. But there was one new recording. It had been created only minutes before the signal appeared. The recording was almost silent. Then a whisper could be heard, a voice saying, "Don't follow us. Part 6, What They Found." The investigators followed the signal deeper into the forest. Eventually, they discovered an abandoned structure. It looked like an old hunting cabin. The door was unlocked. Inside, the walls were covered with photographs. Dozens of them. Some showed hikers. Some showed campers. Some showed families standing beside their tents. And many of the photographs were taken without the people knowing. The investigators recognized several faces. They belonged to people who had disappeared in the area over the previous 20 years. But there was something even worse. The newest photograph was of the missing couple. It had been taken the night they disappeared. From inside their campsite, investigators checked the cabin carefully. There was no electricity, no working phone, no obvious place where anyone could have been hiding. But behind one wall, they discovered a narrow passage. It led underground. The passage was almost completely collapsed. Only a small section could be entered. Inside were personal belongings, backpacks, shoes, wallets, old phones, and dozens of objects belonging to missing hikers. But the couple wasn't there. Instead, investigators found something written on the wall. 4 words. They heard it too. Nobody knew what that meant. Part 7. The Last Clue. The investigation eventually went cold. No bodies were found, no suspect was identified, and no one could explain the photograph. Months later, the case file was officially classified as an unexplained disappearance. But one ranger kept investigating. He returned to the campsite alone. He wanted to understand what the couple might have experienced that night. He brought the original trail camera footage. Then he noticed something investigators had missed. Frame by frame, he watched the final seconds before the camera was covered. The tall figure appeared again, but this time he noticed something behind it. A second figure, standing much farther away, then a third, and then a fourth, all watching the campsite. The ranger froze, because the figures weren't approaching. They were standing in a perfect circle around the campsite, as if they were waiting. He zoomed in on the final frame and saw something that made him immediately leave the area. The closest figure was facing the camera, but its face wasn't visible. Instead, it was wearing the missing camper's jacket. The same jacket investigators had found inside the tent. The couple was never found. Their belongings were returned to their families. The campsite was eventually closed. The cabin was demolished, and the trail camera was removed. But the story didn't end there. Years later, another ranger reported finding a small fire burning at the same campsite. There was no one around it. No tent, no vehicle, just a fire. Beside it were 2 cups and 2 pairs of hiking boots. The ranger called for backup. Before anyone arrived, he noticed something scratched into the ground. 4 words. The same 4 words found inside the abandoned cabin. They heard it too. The campsite was closed again, but nobody could explain who had built the fire or why the boots were there. And maybe that's the most terrifying part, because sometimes the scariest thing in the forest isn't what you see, it's what you hear. When you realize something out there has been listening to you the entire time,